The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official seal glinting in the autumn sunlight. Margaret Chen stood on her porch, still holding her coffee mug, as she read the words that would change everything. Violation notice, unapproved landscaping must be removed within 14 days. She looked up at her front yard, where native wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their purple and gold petals hosting dozens of monarch butterflies. The garden had taken her 3 years to establish, carefully researched and meticulously planted according to specifications from the State Wildlife Conservation Department. It wasn't just beautiful, it was legally protected habitat for endangered species. Margaret was 62, a retired environmental biologist with silver hair she kept in a practical bun, and the kind of patient demeanor that came from decades of dealing with bureaucracy. She wore her usual uniform of khaki pants and a faded university sweatshirt, reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied the letter more carefully. The HOA president's signature was unmistakable. Diane Sutherland, the woman who'd moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and immediately began improving things. Diane was everything Margaret wasn't: 45, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer athleisure wear, and an Instagram presence dedicated to luxury suburban living. She'd already forced 3 families to repaint their houses and had banned children's chalk drawings from driveways. Margaret walked back inside and pulled out a thick folder from her filing cabinet. Inside were her state permits, wildlife sanctuary designation papers, and a letter from the governor's office commending her conservation work. She'd done everything legally, obtained every approval, and registered her property as part of a statewide habitat corridor program 2 years before Diane had even moved to Maplewood Estates. The next HOA meeting was packed. Diane sat at the head of the community center table, flanked by 2 board members who nodded at everything she said. She wore a white blazer that screamed authority, her tablet displaying photos of Margaret's garden with red circles drawn around the problem areas. "This eyesore violates our aesthetic standards," Diane announced, clicking through images. Section 4.2 of our bylaws clearly states all front yards must maintain manicured grass with approved ornamental plants only. Mrs. Chen's weed patch is bringing down property values. Several neighbors murmured agreement. Margaret noticed most of them were newer residents, people who'd bought into Diane's vision of a picture-perfect suburb where every lawn looked identical. Margaret raised her hand calmly. "May I respond?" Diane's smile was condescending. "Of course, Margaret. But the decision is final. You have 12 days remaining." Margaret stood, placing her folder on the table. "This isn't a weed patch. It's a state-certified wildlife sanctuary, specifically designated for monarch butterfly conservation. I have permits from the State Wildlife Conservation Department, approval from the Environmental Protection Agency, and my property is registered under the Federal Endangered Species Act Protection Program." The room went quiet. Diane's smile faltered for just a moment before recovering. "HOA bylaws supersede personal projects, Margaret. We have standards to maintain." "Actually," Margaret said, her voice steady but firm, "federal environmental law supersedes HOA bylaws. My garden is protected habitat. Any attempt to force its removal would violate multiple state and federal statutes." Diane's face flushed pink. "We'll see about that. This HOA has excellent legal counsel." Over the next week, the harassment escalated. Margaret received daily letters, each more threatening than the last. The fine started at $500, then doubled to $1,000. Diane began posting in the neighborhood Facebook group, sharing close-up photos of Margaret's violation with captions like "When neighbors refuse to respect community standards and one person's selfishness affects us all." Several neighbors stopped waving when Margaret checked her mail. Someone left a printout of proper landscaping examples on her doorstep. The HOA's lawyer sent a letter threatening legal action and a lien on her property. Margaret remained calm. She contacted her own attorney, a former colleague who specialized in environmental law and had been waiting for a case exactly like this. She also reached out to the state wildlife department, the local news, and several conservation organizations she'd worked with over the years. 10 days after the initial notice, Diane appeared at Margaret's door unannounced, accompanied by a landscaping crew. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a clipboard like a weapon. "We're here to correct your violation," Diane announced. "Since you've refused to comply, the HOA is exercising its right to remedy the situation and bill you for services." Margaret stood in her doorway, phone in hand. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." "You can't stop us. Read your HOA contract." Diane gestured to the crew. "Gentlemen, begin removing those weeds." "Those aren't weeds," came a voice from behind them. A woman in a khaki uniform with a state badge approached, flanked by 2 officers. "Those are federally protected native plants supporting an endangered species migration corridor. I'm Agent Rebecca Torres with the State Wildlife Conservation Department." Diane's face went white. "This is HOA property management. You have no jurisdiction." Agent Torres held up an official document. "This property is registered under State Conservation Program 447B and protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Any disturbance to this habitat is a criminal offense punishable by fines up to $50,000 per violation and possible imprisonment. Your landscaping crew needs to leave immediately." The crew didn't need to be told twice. They were in their truck within seconds. Diane sputtered, her composure completely shattered. "The HOA has rights. We have property value standards. This is ridiculous." "What's ridiculous," Margaret said quietly, "is that you never bothered to check why my garden looked different. You never asked questions. You just assumed you had power you didn't actually have." A news van pulled up to the curb. Margaret had called them that morning, knowing Diane would attempt something dramatic. The reporter who stepped out was already recording. "Ms. Sutherland, can you comment on why the Maplewood Estates HOA attempted to destroy legally protected wildlife habitat?" Diane fled to her car without another word. The story went viral within hours. HOA versus butterflies became a national headline. Margaret's phone rang constantly with interview requests, conservation groups praising her work, and neighbors, the long-time residents who'd always admired her garden, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. The HOA held an emergency meeting 3 days later. Diane was nowhere to be seen. The board issued a formal apology to Margaret and announced they were revising their bylaws to exempt environmental conservation projects. They also revealed Diane had submitted her resignation, effective immediately. Margaret stood in her garden that evening, watching monarchs dance among the wildflowers. The setting sun painted everything gold and orange, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she felt truly peaceful. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Torres. "Your sanctuary has been approved for expansion funding. You're doing important work. Keep fighting." Margaret smiled, removing her reading glasses to watch a butterfly land on a purple coneflower. She'd spent her entire career protecting the environment from people who valued appearance over substance, aesthetics over ecosystems. This time, the butterflies had won. And so had common sense. Within a month, 3 other neighbors applied for conservation permits to transform their own yards. The local elementary school requested Margaret's help starting a native plant garden. The State Wildlife Department featured her sanctuary in their annual report. And Diane. The last Margaret heard, she'd moved to a condo with no yard at all, where the only thing she could control was her own balcony. Margaret couldn't help but think it was probably for the best. Some people were meant to nurture living things. Others were only capable of trying to control them. As autumn deepened and the monarchs began their migration south, Margaret stood among her wildflowers and thought about legacy. Not the manicured, artificial perfection Diane had chased, but the real, messy, beautiful work of protecting something that mattered. Her garden would be here long after she was gone, a living testament to what happened when you chose substance over appearance, patience over power. And that, Margaret thought, was worth fighting for.